Can Francisco Lindor still be the best player on the New York Mets? I believe he can. And on today's show, I'm going to talk about that because if you go into the past, Carlos Beltran was once a first year player with the Mets that really struggled, only to bounce back in a huge way in year two. I believe we will see the same from Lindor this season. He spoke with the media today for the first time in spring training, had a lot of interesting comments about what went wrong last year. And I think that he is in the right headspace to have a much better season this time around. Going to talk about all of that on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, Francisco Lindor met with the media for the first time in spring today, and my gut reaction just from the start was he looked absolutely jacked. And I've said the same thing about Starling Marte. You see these guys going around in that workout tee, and for Marte, it looks like the guns are going to burst out through the sleeves. I felt the same way looking at Lindor today. I mean, this is a supremely gifted athlete, and you could just see that. But also, I loved how candid he was in this conversation with the media, really owning what last year was for him and how he has worked to improve himself to be ready for this season. I think one of the quotes that really went viral and went around a lot was that he said he tried to wrap his arms around it, meaning New York. I tried to give it a big hug, he said, but my arms aren't that big. There was a lot of leaking. Life was a little faster for me last year. Said he gave it his best effort, but it wasn't as productive as he wanted to be. I appreciate that honesty, and it makes complete sense. This is a player that went from being the homegrown superstar in Cleveland, where he could go through a slump and no one would boo him. No one would care. The media wouldn't get on him. He could just work his way through a season and not have to deal with all that external pressure. And now you're in New York under the bright lights with the added pressure of a $341 million contract you signed right before opening day. So much went into his struggles last year. And I can see, or you almost could have seen during that season, that he did look overwhelmed at times, and he is, giving some credence to that by these comments. He wanted to be everything to everyone last year. If you remember going back to spring training, there was a school that he went to, his prep school. I don't remember the name of it now. His high school, where they opened a Francisco Lindor building, and he donated a ton of money to the school, and there was so many different things happening. He had a huge deal with, what is it? It's not Reebok. Is it New Balance? I think he's a New Balance guy. But a huge shoe deal that came out, like so many different things that happened to him in his professional career off the field that went with him trying to adjust to New York City. And I just think that all of it added up, and he really is saying that was the case here, that he was just overwhelmed at times and things were moving really fast. He talked about how, there was some days where he would, hit the bed and just be like, how did that day fly by so quick? And he said at times it felt the same way in the batter's box, where he would go up for an at bat and it would be over in a second, where there was other times where he felt a little more comfortable in his normal rhythm and was able to have good at bats and put together some success. So he spent this off season trying to fix that, trying to create a better life balance. He talked about trying to balance, being a father, being a husband, and also being a ball player and a person. And that is what his offseason was all about. So I thought all that was really interesting. Also, Buck Showalter has said this throughout spring a couple of times now, that New York fans are waiting to embrace you, but you have to give them something that they can grasp onto, that they can embrace you for. And Lindor said that exact same quote, talking about how Buck had told him that, and it really hit home for him. He also said that Buck reminds him a lot of Tito. And obviously Tito is Terry Francona, his manager for all those years in Cleveland. they had a great relationship. So it's good to see that Buck Showalter might be able to get some of the same things out of Lindor. I think that alignment that you have from the manager to the star players is really important. And that's why Buck is so good at what he does, because he's able to connect with players. Lindor also talked about how, there's a lot of new faces, but he feels a lot more comfortable this time around, which again, just comes with time. And later on in the show today, in the last segment, I'm going to compare Lindor to Carlos Beltran. If you look at Beltran's first season, he was not good. He was slightly below average. Honestly, his numbers a little bit worse than Lindor's, and we'll compare those in a little bit. But the point being, you go to year 2, which is 2006, and we all remember how great Carlos Beltran was. And he goes on to have arguably, the most prolific, 7-year stretch for an offensive player in Mets history. If you really dive into the numbers, Carlos Beltran was excellent. Francisco Lindor has the chance to do something very similar with the Mets this season. And I think when you see that comfort level, when you see him wearing a chain, a New York Mets chain around his neck, when he talked about, Javi Baez, and it was sad to see him go, but Javi's in a good place for him, and he's totally on board with everything the Mets are doing. He is a New York Met. He's looking forward to the next decade with the Mets. These are all positive signs that Francisco Lindor is embracing still being the face of this franchise and is getting more and more comfortable in that role, getting more comfortable being a Met when his entire career before that was about being in Cleveland. So I think that you see all these different things falling into place for Lindor, and then the pressure that gets taken off now when you add a Max Scherzer, another star that will lead this team. When Jacob deGrom is hopefully healthy for a full year, when you bring in a Starling Marte and a Mark Canha and Eduardo Escobar, a lot of different players, even Robinson Cano being back, could lead to some better performance from Lindor. He talked about how Cano is a really calming presence, and it was just interesting to see him go about his at-bats and go through his process, and how he was just in control and very smooth about everything that he does throughout his routine there. And you compare that to what he discussed from last season, how everything was moving fast for him. Cano can be another player that can guide him, that can really help him with that. And I know you look at Robinson Cano and no one thinks, leader, because what kind of leader keeps on getting suspended for performance enhancing drugs? But you still have to remember what he's accomplished in his career. And it's hard for other players to not still have some level of respect for him aside from the steroids, when you realize who he has been and what he has been able to accomplish, and being a star player for over a decade who just continues to produce. There's a wealth of knowledge that comes with that. And I think that will really help a player like Francisco Lindor. Now, the one other big takeaway that I had from this press conference was finally getting to hear Lindor's side of the Jeff McNeil beef, and that there isn't any, which is what I've been saying throughout the offseason. There's been so much pressure because there was an article written from the New York Post, if I'm not mistaken, that detailed the rift between McNeil and Lindor, and talked about how McNeil didn't like to be shifting and Lindor was trying to enforce what the club wanted, and all of that drama that happened. What was it, in April or May? And there was this thought that that would carry over, and that Jeff McNeil had to be traded because the divide between him and Lindor was so great that they couldn't play together. You hear Lindor now say that that's behind them, that McNeil's a good guy, that McNeil's just a competitor, that the two of them just want to win. And that's what I thought all last season. Why would Francisco Lindor be so opposed to playing with Jeff McNeil that he would avoid or push him off the team when he might be the best thing for this Mets team? And I really think Jeff McNeil is that. The two of them are going to be playing together up the middle. Buck Showalter already said that Jeff McNeil is going to be essentially the starting second baseman. He said Cano will get some time there, but a majority of the playing time will go to Jeff McNeil at second. The two of them defensively can be very special. Obviously, Lindor is, in my opinion, the best defensive shortstop in baseball, and Jeff McNeil always grades out as a really good defensive second baseman. They're both really athletic, and I think that the two of them could end up having a really great relationship down the line, to be able to go through some contention in year one and then to maybe have a ton of success and win a lot in year two. I think all of this will really be behind them once they start winning. But right now, they are both committed to the New York Mets and to winning baseball games. And really, that's all you need out of your teammates. Keith Hernandez and Gary Carter were never buddy-buddy, but they had a common goal, and that was to win. And because of that, they were able to respect one another. I can see Jeff McNeil and Francisco Lindor having that same mutual respect, not only going into the season, but having that respect continue to grow if they win together, which I expect they'll do a lot of winning this upcoming season. Now, with all that said, nothing else I really took much from the Lindor press conference other than the fact that he was extremely professional, extremely honest, and extremely engaging. So it's just really exciting to have a star like Lindor. And the fact is, when he gets in front of the cameras, you cannot deny his star power. It's certainly more star power than a shortstop like his Drupal Cabrera, Wilmer Flores, Omar Cantanilla, Ruben Tejada, all the shortstops we've seen over the past decade. And I always have to think about them when I see Mets fans criticizing Lindor because there's just no comparison. This is the best shortstop the Mets have had in a really long time. And I would look forward to some good seasons with Lindor front and center for years to come here. So I want to get into the numbers a bit. I want to talk about his season last year and what went wrong, but what we can also project for him moving forward based on the career numbers and even what Fangrass has him doing this season when you look at their projection models. So we're going to get to all of that in just a minute. But I am curious, are you ready to discover your purpose and leave an impact wherever you go? Because Mission Possible, which is written and read by New York Times bestselling author and former Met Tim Tebow, it will encourage you to find your passion, pursue your purpose, and create a life for yourself that counts. Ignite a new spark in your life through this inspirational listen. Mission Possible by Tim Tebow is available everywhere audiobooks are sold. All right, so as we dive into Francisco Lindor's 2021 season, no one is going to say that he had a good year because he didn't. And if you put it all together, you look at the net result: a 230 average, 322 on base, 412 slugging percentage, 20 home runs, 63 RBIs, 10 stolen bases. His weighted runs created plus was 103, which again, that is a stat, WRC plus, that measures hitters based on a league average of 100. So he was only slightly better than league average. With that said, you look at the Mets as a team. Last year, Francisco Lindor was second on the team behind Pete Alonso in home runs, runs, and RBIs. So even in his worst year, he was more productive than basically anybody in the Mets lineup outside of Alonso. Now, that says a lot about how bad the Mets were offensively last year, but also if you look at the breakdown of his season, and I've said this time and again, but I'll give you the stats now to back it up, Francisco Lindor from June 1st on was a good offensive player. And all of us, or all of the fans, really did ignore that just based on a horrible start. And it was a horrible start prior to June 1st. He hit 194, a 294 on base percentage, a 294 slugging percentage, only had 4 home runs and 11 RBIs in 46 games. That's 200 plate appearances with only 11 RBIs. It's dreadful. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But what I will do is give him the benefit of the doubt and look at his season as a whole and remember that from June 1st on, he was a good player. He hit 252, a 340 on base, a 482 slugging percentage. You look at that compared to his career line, right? He's a career 278 hitter. So the average was still down, but career 343 on base percentage. Again, from June 1st on, that on base was 340. He was basically in line with who he's been throughout his career. Maybe some more walks than hits typically, but still was getting on base. His slugging percentage for his career is 478. Again, from June 1st on, it was 482. A little bit better than his career mark. And then you go to the WRC plus. It was 117 for his career, which I do want to spend a little bit of time on because there is this misconception of who Lindor is as a player, that he's going to be a guy that's supposed to have a 130 WRC plus and be 30% better than your league average hitter. For his career, it's 117, meaning 17% better than a league average hitter. Where he draws most of his value has always been with the glove. But what you want from him is to be able to be a 30 home run shortstop while being the best defensive shortstop in baseball. And what he was from June 1st on was 16 home runs and 52 RBIs. That's a 79 game sample. So not hard to multiply that by 2. If he played 158 games the way he played the second half of the season or from June 1st on, you're talking about 32 home runs, 104 RBIs, a 124 WRC plus. His F4 was 2.5, so that's a 5 WAR season. No one would have talked at all about Francisco Lindor being anything but himself had he played that way the whole year. It was a dreadful start. He has to own that, and now he has to overcome it and get off to a much better start this season. But Francisco Lindor still showed us that he's capable of being that guy that he's always been. Not to mention, he was just absolutely fantastic, was on another level in September, which included, of course, that 3 home run game against the Yankees. Now, from 2017 through 2019, in that 3 year window, Francisco Lindor was 30 home runs every year. Best year came in 2018, where he had the 38 home runs and the 132 WRC plus. But people have these expectations of Lindor that he's going to hit 320. And his on base percentage will be 380. He'll slug 550 with 40 home runs every year. That's not who he's been. A good Francisco Lindor season, it's about a 270 average. Maybe the on base percentage is around 330 to 350. Slugging percentage just over 500. That's what he was from 2017 through 2019. And hopefully that's the guy the Mets get this next year. You want 30 home runs from him, 15 to 20 stolen bases, while giving you elite defense. Fangrass has their projection models, which we've been doing in our setting expectations episodes as I've previewed seasons for a lot of these guys heading into 2022. We're going to do that again here, where I'll go through all the projection models, what they have for Lindor. But I also want to compare his season last year to Carlos Beltran's first year in Queens, because the numbers are eerily similar. And then we'll dive into what Beltran did in year 2 and why I think Lindor is in line to have a similar season with the Mets this upcoming year. Before we get to that, though, this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing only the brand their warehouse happens to carry, where instead you can go to rockauto.com and save 30%, 50%, maybe even 100% more for the exact same auto parts that you would find at a chain store or new car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business that's been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer, so go explore their easy-to-use website now at rockauto.com. See all the parts available for a car or a truck, and write Locked On in there. How'd you hear about us box? So they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, so now let's look at Fangrass projection models for Francisco Lindor's 2022 season. And basically, the easiest way to surmise this is they think he's going to be better than he was last year, but not as good as he's been throughout his career, somewhere in between there. You look at the games played, they have him between 132 and 152 games. Batting average between 252 and 262. That was the range from the 7 models. On base, 330 to 337. Slugging percentage, 441 to 467. Base that again on his career line. 278 career hitter, so about 10 to 20 points higher than the models are having him, but that's also 10 to 20 points higher than he hit last year when he was in the 230s. On base percentage, 343 for his career. On base from the projections, 330 to 337, slightly below what he has been. Slugging percentage, 478 for his career. Again, slugging percentage based on the models between 441 and 467. You look at what they're projecting for home runs, runs scored, RBIs between 24 and 30 home runs, 85 and 98 runs scored, 74 and 93 RBIs, 30 to 18 or 30, 13 to 18 stolen bases, and a WRC plus of 112 through 119 is where that range was. So again, slightly below where he's been, but better than last season. When I look at Francisco Lindor, I've made this comparison many times if you've been listening to the show since the end of last year, because I wanted to look up Carlos Beltran's first year with the Mets because these players have such similar profiles. You're talking about guys that come up in small markets. For Beltran, it was Kansas City. For Lindor, obviously Cleveland. They are the guy, the homegrown superstar, whatever you want to call it. Don't have that pressure, go through the early parts of their career, end up landing in a big market to get paid, which is what happened with Beltron and also what happened with Lindor. Also, I don't think I even noted both Puerto Rican born players. Beltron in year one with the New York Mets. He hit 266. So right there, you said, okay, it's better than Lindor at 230, but his on base percentage was 330. Lindor's was 322. So pretty similar. Slugging percentage, nearly identical. For Beltron, 414. For Lindor, 412. Lindor had 20 home runs in less games. Beltron had 16 home runs. You have the WRC plus, which again measures hitters based on a league average of 100. For Lindor, as I said, it was 103. For Beltran, it was 96. He graded out as a below average hitter. Now, that could also be because the league that year was maybe better than it is now. Hitting was still at a premium during those early 2000s, maybe a little more steroids back then. I don't want to call people out, but that was steroid era adjacent, I would say. You look at the F war. Carlos Beltran, 2.3, Francisco Lindor, 2.7. So Lindor's first year with the Mets, slightly better than Beltran's. Then you look at the narrative around the two of them. At the time, 2005, there was the Beltron can't handle New York. Beltron can't handle the booze. All that same stuff that was happening with Lindor. You go into a year two, a big offseason for both of these teams. That offseason heading into 2006 was huge for the Mets. They get Paul Lo Duca, the big addition, of course, Carlos Delgado. Should have mentioned him before Lo Duca. Maybe that's just because Lo Duca was a fan favorite for me, but Delgado was a monster addition to hit behind Beltran, give him ultimate security in that lineup, something that Pete Alonso is already providing for Lindor, but will again next season. They make all these big splashes. They become a little bit more of this star-studded roster in 06, and they go on to have an unbelievable season as a team. But Beltran was a huge part of that season because he bounced back in a massive way, hit 275, 388 on base, 594 slugging, 41 home runs, 127 runs scored, 116 RBIs, a 148 WRC plus, 48% better than your league average hitter, a 7.8 F4 season, so almost an 8-win season. Dynamic. And every single time I look at Beltran's 06, I try to say, okay, well, he should have been the MVP, and I go to make the case. And then I go to the voting, and I realize once again that he was fourth for a reason because Ryan Howard had 58 home runs, 149 RBIs. Pujols and Berkman both had 45 home run seasons with 135 plus RBIs. I believe Pujols was 49 homers and 137, and I think Berkman was 46 and 135. So just ridiculous offensive seasons from those three sluggers, but Beltran was not far behind, and he was providing Gold Glove defense, won both the Gold Glove and the Silver Slugger. I go into this year, and history is always doomed to repeat itself, or in this case, you hope it repeats itself, where these things just seem to have a cyclical phase where it's just going to happen again. And Lindor to be a similar player, to have a similar down year, to now be comfortable as a Met. You're going through your second spring training where you know where everyone is, everything is, who everyone is around the staff, and then you're going to go back up the Citi Field a lot more comfortable, a lot, better prepared to attack this season. And I think that's why we saw Beltran have a huge jump, and we could see that with Lindor as well. I have this projection model that I have not released to the audience yet. It's a new one I'm coming up with. We're calling it Fink's eye/gut test. Okay, this is what my gut's telling me. Okay, I just like my gut tells me that Pete Alonso is going to lead the National League in RBIs, or also that my gut's telling me that Jeff McNeil and Carlos Carrasco are going to have bounce back years. My gut says the same thing about Lindor, that he's going to have a season just like the one we saw Beltran have in 2006. This might be the best year that Francisco Lindor has in a Mets uniform. I think generally he'll still be that guy with the WRC plus in the 117 to 120 range, but he's going to have years here and there where he is going to pop. And I think this is that year for Lindor where the Mets are going to have a really special season and he's going to be in the middle of all of it. So this projection model, the Fink's eye/gut test, says that Lindor is going to hit 280 this year, 360 on base, 510 slugging. He's going to have 35 home runs. He's going to eclipse 100 RBIs and 100 runs scored. His WRC plus will be over 130, and his F4 is going to be over 7. Okay, it's going to be a monster year for Lindor that will have him finishing in the top 10, if not the top 5 in MVP voting. I love all the additions the Mets made this offseason. I really do. But when it comes to the lineup, I still believe they go as Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor go. I imagine they will be the 3 and 4 hitters for the Mets, with Lindor batting third and Pete Alonso being your traditional cleanup hitter, with on-base machines like Starling Marte and Brandon Nimmo hitting above them in the lineup. That's going to give both of those guys a ton of run-producing opportunities. I think we're going to see the best out of Francisco Lindor this season. So I'm looking forward to it. And I think fans need to cut him some slack here and try to embrace him this season, because it's not often that the Mets have a player as talented as Francisco Lindor. So that's something that should be, embraced. Just that simple. Just like Buck Showalter said, the fans are waiting to embrace you, and I think they will this season. Now, quick note, got to talk about some movement from the Braves, because you hate it when Atlanta makes some really quality moves, and they've done it. They've made 2 brilliant moves, in my opinion, when it comes to some of these transactions. The first was obviously the Matt Olson trade, but the fact that they have now signed him to an 8-year, $168 million extension, just genius by Alex Anthopoulos. It's a genius move. It really is. You cut out the sentimentality of a Freddie Freeman. I get it, but Freeman's going to get north of 30, not 35 million a year. Who knows how much money he's going to get now that there's this, full league-wide bidding war for his services. And for Matt Olson now, you get a player that, can be better than Freeman over the next 8 years or even the next 5 years, right? I really think Olson, because he's younger, he's a better defensive player. He has all of the potential in the world to just be an absolute superstar in Atlanta, and really, take that mantle as their best player. He's blessed that he has $168 million in his pocket. I'll tell you that. But I mean, you look at his value and what he would have made in free agency. It's a great contract for them. It's $21 million a year. So I think that Freeman's going to make a lot more over 6 years than the Braves are going to be paying Olson over 8. And that's just good business. Now you move over to the other addition they just made. They signed former Met and also former Ray, Colin McHugh, who had a great year in Tampa last year, where he pitched to a 1.55 ERA. I've talked about McHugh a lot this offseason. For one, how he's had a better career than Matt Harvey, strangely, but also how he's really remade himself into this dynamic relief pitcher that I thought would have looked great back in a Mets uniform this season. And it's frustrating to see him go to Atlanta and also go on a contract that's not crazy. He's making $10 million over 2 years. So he gets an extra year than Adam Ottavino, but essentially the same type of a contract. $6 million club option for the following season, $1 million buyout. He is a Georgia native, so maybe he wanted to pitch in Atlanta. That might be something that was on the bucket list of his career. And also, he might not have had a good time with the Mets. He certainly wasn't a great pitcher back then. So maybe a reunion was not something that he favored, or maybe the Mets weren't interested, although I think there was some rumored interest that was reported. So unfortunate to see a really good relief option off the board, but particularly to see him go to the Atlanta Braves, who just continue to make wise moves. And they're still, they're the reigning champs. They're the team to beat. The Mets have to go out and prove it. But I think that this is going to be a fascinating race to watch all year with these two teams. And there's going to be some new villains, and Matt Olson is certainly a Mets killer on the watch here to see what he's going to do over the next 8 seasons. Regardless, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB, hosted by Paul Francis Sullivan, but we call him Sully. Locked On MLB is where you want to go for all of the latest news when it comes to free agency right now. So make sure you follow Locked On MLB wherever you get podcasts.